So, back in 1998, there was this highly publicized research paper that, like, fundamentally altered global dietary guidelines.
Oh, yeah, a massive shift.
Right. Governments changed their food pyramids, billions of dollars shifted in the agricultural sector, and, entire generations totally alter what they were putting on their dinner plates.
All based on one foundational premise.
Exactly. And it took the scientific community over a decade to realize that the entire study was built on, well, a collapsed foundation.
Yeah, they had constructed a literature review that it systematically ignored 20 years of conflicting data.
Just completely tossed it out. They focused only on the historical studies that supported their specific hypothesis.
Right. And the wild part is the new data they gathered for the experiment was technically accurate.
But because the foundational context was manufactured, the conclusions were practically useless.
Completely useless.
So today we are taking a deep dive into the invisible architecture of human knowledge. Welcome back to our ongoing series on mastering research.
It's good to be back.
If you were joining us, you probably already know that true discovery is not just a matter of aggressive search engine queries.
Right, or just finding confirmation for what you already suspect to be true.
Yeah, confirmation bias is a killer. So our mission today is laser focus on the mechanics of building a strong research foundation.
And that 1998 dietary study you mentioned, it's the perfect cautionary tale for this.
It really is.
It illustrates the catastrophic difference between conducting an experiment and conducting actual research.
Because they aren't the same thing, right?
Not at all. You can have the most pristine data collection methods in the world utilizing cutting-edge statistical software.
Massive sample sizes.
Exactly, massive sample sizes. But if you do not understand the existing landscape of human knowledge, you are basically building a skyscraper in quicksand.
That's a great way to put it.
Academic research demands a methodical approach that actively attempts to stress test and really dismantle your initial assumptions.
So you have to know exactly where the boundary of human knowledge currently sits.
Right. You have to know where the boundary is so you can take one deliberate step past it.
So to find that boundary, a researcher has to first map the territory, which brings us to the literature review.
Ah, yes. The dreaded literature review.
Right. For anyone who has spent time in academia, that term can sometimes trigger this, like Pavlovian groan.
Oh, absolutely. People hate it.
Because it's often treated as a chore, right? Like this annoying hurdle to clear before getting to the real work of gathering new data.
Yeah, but that's a huge misconception. The literature review is actually the most critical intellectual exercise of the entire project.
The absolute bedrock.
Exactly. It is the absolute bedrock. A literature review is not just a comprehensive summary of, everything ever written on a topic.
It's not a book report.
No, not at all. It is an architectural component. You are contextualizing your specific, narrow research within a vast existing body of work.
You're defining the theoretical lens you're using.
Precisely. When you construct a proper review, you are signaling to the reader that you understand the historical friction in the field.
You know where the dead ends are.
Right. You prove you aren't just wasting resources reinventing the wheel.
I want to look at the psychology of that for a second, specifically for the researcher who's actually doing the writing.
Okay, yeah.
Because there's this concept known as the learning pyramid, which models how humans retain information.
Oh, right, where passive reading has a really low retention rate.
Exactly. Passive reading only yields about a 10% retention rate. But the moment you are forced to teach that material to someone else,
your retention just skyrockets.
Yeah, to like 90%.
Yeah.
So writing the literature review seems to force the researcher into the role of a teacher.
That mechanism is entirely intentional, by the way.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. When you take on the role of the teacher in a literature review, you are actively demonstrating mastery.
Because you can't just skim 30 papers.
No, you have to digest them deeply enough to explain their interconnections to an audience. You are curating a specific historical narrative of the field.
To show the reader exactly why your new original research is the logical next step.
Right. But getting to that point of mastery requires navigating an overwhelming volume of information.
Yeah, because there are millions of peer-reviewed papers published every year.
Exactly. If you just wade into a database and start reading randomly, you will drown.
You need a highly structured strategy.
Yes. You need a highly structured strategy for gathering and processing that literature.
So let's ground this in a real-world scenario to see how those strategies actually play out for you, the listener.
I like that. Let's do it.
Suppose we are investigating the transition to a 4-day work week. It's a massive, complex topic, right? Touching on economics, psychology, corporate management.
Oh, yeah. It's everywhere right now.
So if I'm approaching this, I have to choose between conducting a narrative review and a systematic literature review,
The SLR, yes.
right? The SLR. How do these two paths actually dictate what I do next?
Well, if you choose a narrative review, your goal is to provide a broad interpretive overview of the 4-day work week.
Like a bird's eye view.
Exactly. You are trying to connect diverse ideas. So maybe you're tracing the history of labor hours from the Industrial Revolution all the way to the post-pandemic remote work era.
You're establishing a very wide context.
Right. You typically see narrative reviews in research proposals, theses, or, introductory chapters.
Because they give you room to breathe.
Yeah, they allow the researcher a certain fluidity to weave a compelling historical and theoretical story.
But that fluidity introduces a massive vulnerability, doesn't it?
It absolutely can.
Because if I'm writing a narrative review, there's no rigid protocol stopping me from subconsciously or intentionally only selecting papers that show the 4-day workweek is a huge success.
Right, while quietly ignoring the studies showing severe drops in productivity.
Exactly. Isn't a narrative review just a polite way of saying the researcher cherry-picked the sources?
Well, that is the fatal flaw of the 1998 dietary study we talked about, and it is the primary risk of the narrative approach.
Because the selection process isn't rigidly defined.
Exactly, which means selection bias can easily infect the foundation. This is exactly why the alternative, the systematic literature review, was developed.
The SLR.
Right. An SLR is an entirely different methodological beast. It is not designed to paint a broad historical picture.
So what is it designed to do?
It is designed to answer a highly specific scientific or clinical question, and it does so using a strict, repeatable protocol.
How specific are we talking? Like, give me an example.
Highly specific. So instead of just researching the 4-day work week, an SLR would ask something like,
Okay.
what is the quantitative impact of a 32-hour work week on employee retention rates in North American mid-sized tech companies between the years 2020 and 2025?
Oh, wow. That is incredibly specific.
Right, and before you even open a database, you write a strict, transparent protocol for how you're going to search for answers.
You define rigid inclusion and exclusion criteria.
Exactly. You dictate exactly which databases you will search, the exact dates of publication you will accept, and, the specific methodologies the underlying papers must have used.
You're essentially building an algorithmic machine to filter the literature for you.
Yes. You're purposefully removing your own subjective bias from the selection process.
But wait, if you're building a systematic review machine, aren't you basically just replacing your subjective selection bias with, like, algorithmic bias?
How do you mean?
Well, if I set my inclusion criteria too narrowly, say I only look at tech companies with over 500 employees, I might totally miss groundbreaking data from smaller startups.
Ah, right.
And that startup data might completely change the context of the retention issue.
That is a highly sophisticated critique, actually, and it is the exact vulnerability most novice researchers overlook when they design an SLR.
So you can easily engineer a systematic protocol that systematically misses the point.
Precisely. To mitigate that, your inclusion and exclusion criteria must be rigorously justified.
You have to defend your choices.
Yes. You have to explain in your methodology why you restricted the search to companies over 500 employees.
And if you can't,
If you cannot provide a sound theoretical or practical justification for that parameter, your protocol is flawed.
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But regardless of whether you choose the fluid path of the narrative review or the rigid path of the SLR, both strategies require raw materials.
You need the actual papers.
Right. And that means knowing how to manipulate databases at an advanced level.
Right.
Let's get into the mechanics of that manipulation.
Okay, let's dive into it.
Because we are well past the point of just typing a few keywords into a standard search engine and hoping for the best, right?
Oh, absolutely. If you want vetted, peer-reviewed primary research, you can't just use a basic search engine.
So where are we actually hunting for our 4-day workweek scenario?
You are operating inside specialized academic databases. Depending on your discipline, this means places like Scopus, Web of Science, JSTOR, PubMed.
Right.
But an often neglected goldmine is what we call gray literature.
Gray literature. That usually refers to, like, government reports, right? Things outside the traditional academic publishing houses.
Yes, government reports, a lot of papers from policy think tanks, working papers from economic bureaus.
industry-specific market research.
Exactly. And for a highly contemporary topic like the 4-day work week, peer-reviewed academic journals might actually be lagging 2 to 3 years behind.
Because the peer review cycle takes so long.
Right. So gray literature provides the real-time data from companies currently experimenting with the model.
Okay, so I am inside a deep web database looking at a mix of academic journals and think tank white papers. How do I actually filter this?
Well, you can't just rely on basic terms.
Yeah, because if I just type in 4-day work week, I am going to get like 200,000 results.
Minimum.
I need to force the database to act surgically.
This is where you have to move beyond basic keywords and really master advanced Boolean logic and proximity operators.
Yes. You are essentially writing code to instruct the database's search algorithm.
Exactly. Most people know the basic operators, right?
Yeah.
And, or, are, and not.
I like to use the peanut butter and jelly analogy here.
Oh, let's hear it.
So using A&D means you only get results with both peanut butter and jelly. It narrows the search.
Right.
Using or are gets you peanut butter, jelly, or both. It broadens it. And using not gets you peanut butter, but strictly excludes jelly.
That's a great way to visualize it. But to perform surgical extraction in a database, you have to nest these operators.
Walk me through a nested search for our specific retention question.
Let's say we want papers discussing a 4-day work week and employee retention. But we know 4-day work week can be phrased in a lot of ways.
Right, like reduced hours or 32-hour week.
Exactly. So first we use wildcards. We might type employ with an asterisk to capture employee, employer, employment.
So the asterisk acts as a catch-all for the end of the word.
Yes. Then we build our nested string. We would use parentheses to group our concepts.
Like an algebra equation.
Basically, yeah. So we type, open parenthesis, quote, 4-day work week, unquote, or our 32-hour, unquote, or reduced hours, close parenthesis.
Okay, that's one group.
Right. Then we type A&D. Then open a new parenthesis, retention or turnover, or, quote, quit rate, unquote, close parenthesis.
Wow. Okay, that casts a very specific net. But what if a paper mentions a 32-hour machine cycle on page 1 and employee turnover on page 20?
Ah.
The database will flag it as a match, right? Even though the paper isn't connecting those two concepts at all.
That is precisely why you deploy proximity operators. They're often formatted as near or W/ followed by a number.
Okay, so how does that change our search?
Instead of a broad A&D, you command the database to only find those terms if they appear within a certain number of words of each other.
Oh, that is powerful.
So you adjust your string, you replace the A&D with, say, W/15.
So the concepts have to be within 15 words of each other.
Exactly. Now, the database will only return papers where the concept of reduced hours appears within 15 words of the concept of employee retention.
You've instantly filtered out thousands of irrelevant papers.
And isolated the exact discussions you need. You are actively shaping the algorithm rather than just being a passive recipient.
So let's say this nested search yields 40 highly relevant, peer-reviewed primary research articles.
Great.
And just to clarify, primary meaning these researchers actually conducted original experiments or surveys, right? Rather than just writing a review article summarizing other people's work.
Yes, primary sources contain original data and methods.
Okay, so I have the 40 papers. I am reading them. But reading for research is fundamentally different than reading for comprehension, isn't it?
Entirely
Now,
different.
I am not just looking to understand what these authors found. I'm looking for the void.
You are hunting for the research gap. The gap is the blank spot on the map.
It's the missing piece.
Exactly. It is the specific area where missing, insufficient, or conflicting information limits our ability to draw definitive conclusions.
So my entire goal in reading those 40 papers is to find the exact point where the current body of knowledge suddenly stops.
So you can build a bridge over it. Yes.
But I mean, finding a void implies you have to read thousands of pages just to notice what isn't being said.
It can feel that way, yes.
That seems incredibly inefficient. Is there a strategic shortcut to spotting these gaps without spending 6 months reading every methodology section in existence?
There is. The most efficient analytical shortcut is to utilize existing review papers in your field.
Even though we just said we want primary data.
Hear me out. While you ultimately need to analyze the primary sources, a recently published review paper is essentially a topographical map drawn by a senior researcher.
Oh, I see. They've already done the heavy lifting.
Right. They have already consolidated vast amounts of literature, mapped the trends, and most importantly, they explicitly discuss the limitations of current studies.
So they point out what's broken or missing.
Exactly. In the final paragraphs of a good review paper, they will practically hand you a roadmap by explicitly suggesting areas for future research.
They pre-validate potential research gaps for you.
They plant a red flag in the ground and say, we don't know what happens here yet.
That's an amazing shortcut. But not all gaps are created equal.
Right. No, they definitely are not.
The framework for gap spotting categorizes these voids into different types. If we apply this to our 4-day workweek scenario, what does a theoretical gap look like?
A theoretical gap occurs when the existing theories established in the literature simply fall short in explaining a specific, new phenomenon.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Let's look at classic theories of workplace motivation. The ones developed in the 1970s and 80s often tie motivation heavily to physical presence, visible effort, and time spent sitting at a desk.
Right, the whole FaceTime culture.
Exactly. Now, if you try to apply those exact theoretical models to a 4-day work week in a fully remote, asynchronous tech company, the theory shatters.
Because it can't explain why people are still getting things done.
Right. It cannot explain the high motivation levels of employees who are entirely invisible for 3 days a week.
So that theoretical failure is a gap waiting to be filled by a new or modified model.
Exactly.
It's the realization that the old physics doesn't apply to the new environment.
That's a great analogy.
What about an empirical gap or a knowledge gap? That one seems a bit more straightforward.
It is. An empirical gap simply means there is a lack of sufficient data, or the existing literature is outdated.
So in our scenario, maybe there are hundreds of studies on the 4-day work week from the manufacturing sector in the 1990s.
Right, but absolutely zero longitudinal data on North American software developers post-2022.
So the gap is simply the absence of data for a specific demographic or time period.
Precisely. Then there is the practice gap.
Oh, this one fascinates me because it moves out of the abstract and into actual human behavior.
Yeah, the practice gap is the friction between a desirable, well-documented state of practice-like official guidelines or corporate policies and what is actually occurring on the ground.
Okay, so the company officially implements a 4-day work week. The HR literature praises the policy.
Right, but your research, perhaps looking at internal communication data or email server logs, reveals that employees are secretly logging in on Fridays for 5 hours just to keep up with their quotas.
Oh, wow. So the practice gap is the glaring difference between the theory of the policy and the reality of the execution.
Exactly. People aren't actually working 4 days, they're just pretending to.
Which leaves the methodological gap. This feels like, I don't know, the most aggressive way to challenge existing literature.
It is highly effective. A methodological gap is identified when you realize that the underlying methods previous researchers used were inherently flawed, biased, or limited in scope.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Perhaps you notice that every single study on 4-day workweek productivity relies entirely on self-reported employee surveys.
Oh, I see. Employees are simply asking themselves, am I productive?
Right. And obviously, they will say yes because they want to keep the perk.
Right. So the methodological gap is the total lack of objective quantitative measurement.
Exactly. You fill that gap by attacking the same old problem with a brand new tool.
Like utilizing background keystroke tracking or measuring the actual velocity of code deployment instead of just asking for opinions.
Precisely.
So if I am designing this research project, I have a strategic choice to make.
You do?
Do I want to try and find a massive, completely empty field of study like trying to invent an entirely new discipline of labor economics? Or do I look for a tiny, highly specific methodological gap in a really crowded field?
It is infinitely more viable and, frankly, more scientifically rigorous to find a tightly defined, specific gap in a crowded field.
Really? Why is that? I feel like people always want to be the pioneer of a brand new field.
Because science is incremental. If you try to invent an entirely new field from scratch, you have no foundational literature to build upon.
Your load-bearing pillars do not exist.
Exactly. Finding a small, specific gap allows you to leverage all the existing, validated literature to support your overarching methodology.
While still contributing a unique, highly focused piece to the puzzle.
Right. You stand on the shoulders of giants to see just a little bit further.
Okay, so we have isolated our gap. We are going to look at the 4-day work week through a methodological gap, utilizing objective software deployment metrics rather than self-reported surveys.
A solid plan.
We are standing on the edge of the void. But before we collect the data, we have to build a blueprint for how we are going to measure things. We have to build a theoretical framework.
Yes. because you cannot just throw raw data at a void and hope it makes sense.
You have to explain the precise mechanism of how you are looking at the problem.
Right. If there is no single perfect theory to explain the relationship you are studying, you might have to stitch together multiple theories to create a custom theoretical framework.
And the core of that framework is a rigorous process called conceptualization, right?
Yes, conceptualization.
This is where things get incredibly slippery for me. It's one thing to measure something physical, like the temperature of a server room, but we're trying to measure things like productivity and employee morale.
Right, which are completely invisible constructs.
They are entirely abstract.
And that's exactly why conceptualization is so vital. It is the systematic process of developing clear, rigorous, unambiguous definitions for those invisible concepts.
Because if you don't lock down a precise definition, your data is meaningless.
Completely meaningless. Let's take morale. What does that actually mean in the context of your specific study?
Right. Does it mean employees like their manager?
Does it mean they feel adequately compensated? Does it mean they have low anxiety?
You have to define the absolute boundaries of the concept.
Yes. You're essentially forcing a ghost to wear a sheet so you can finally see its shape and measure it.
Huh. Catching a ghost. I love that analogy. But once I define it, I have to make sure my measurement tools actually capture the whole thing, right?
Absolutely.
Because if my definition of morale includes compensation, workload, and management respect, but the diagnostic survey I use only measures workload, I've failed.
You have failed to achieve what is called content validity.
Content validity.
Right. Content validity requires you to specify every dimension in your definition, sample from all those dimensions, and develop specific indicators that tap into every single part.
You cannot define a concept broadly and then measure it narrowly.
Exactly. Furthermore, you have to define your unit of analysis.
What do you mean by that?
Well, are you studying the morale of an individual developer? Or the collective morale of a specific engineering team?
Yeah.
Or the overarching morale of the entire corporation as a single entity?
Oh, I see. Mixing those up will destroy your statistical analysis.
Completely.
You know, this friction in how we define and measure invisible things, it naturally pulls us into the philosophical underpinnings of research itself.
It really does. It all comes back to philosophy.
Because how I define productivity or morale depends entirely on my worldview. If two researchers are looking at the exact same 4-day workweek data set, they might arrive at completely different conclusions based on their underlying research philosophy.
Absolutely. The two dominant paradigms here are positivism and interpretivism.
Let's break those down. Positivism first.
Positivism is the belief that objective truths exist independently of human perception. There is a single, measurable reality out there.
So a positivist researcher approaches the 4-day workweek looking for hard, quantitative data.
Right. They want to measure lines of code written, revenue generated per quarter, and exact turnover percentages.
They want to establish statistical causality. They view the organization as a machine, and they are measuring its output.
Perfectly said. But the interpretivist researcher looks at that same company and says,
You are missing the actual human experience.
Precisely. Interpretivism, or constructivism, as it's sometimes called, argues that reality is socially constructed and inherently subjective.
Truth is based on interpretation.
Right. An interpretivist isn't interested in a massive statistical survey of code deployment. They want to conduct deep, qualitative, semi-structured interviews.
They want to know how the 4-day workweek alters an employee's sense of identity.
Yes. How it changes the power dynamics in team meetings, and what meaning the employees assign to their newfound free time.
So the positivist asks, how much? While the interpretivist asks, why and how?
That is the core distinction, yes.
Is one inherently better than the other? Or is it just about matching the philosophy to the specific research gap you're trying to fill?
It is entirely about matching the tool to the gap. However, many modern researchers adopt a stance of pragmatism.
Pragmatism, like just doing whatever works.
Essentially, yes. Pragmatism bypasses the philosophical debate entirely and argues for using whatever method best solves the specific research problem.
So this often leads to mixed methods research.
Exactly. In our scenario, a pragmatist might use positivist quantitative data like code deployment speeds to see if productivity changed.
And then use interpretivist qualitative interviews to understand why the engineers changed their behavior.
Right. You get the best of both worlds.
Okay, so we have our databases, our Boolean search strings, our identified methodological gap, our conceptualized definitions of productivity, and our pragmatic philosophical stance.
We are ready to build.
Now, we are staring at a blank page. We have to actually write the literature review.
The hardest part.
And this is where we hit the most critical distinction in all of academic writing, the difference between summary and synthesis.
Yes. If a listener takes only one principle away from this entire deep dive, it should be this cardinal rule: never write literature summaries.
Never.
Never. A literature review must be an active evaluation, a comparison, a critical synthesis of various pieces of research. It is not a chronological list of book reports.
A summary is essentially writing. One researcher found X in 2020, another researcher found Y in 2021, a third argued Z in 2023.
Right. It is just a sequential listing of facts.
And the problem is that requires the reader to do the exhausting mental labor of figuring out how those three papers relate to the broader gap we're looking at.
It is entirely passive. It shows you know how to read, but it does not show you know how to analyze.
So what is synthesis then?
True synthesis is an act of intellectual alchemy. You are forcing these disparate scholars into a direct conversation with each other on the page.
Oh, like hosting a really tense dinner party.
Exactly. You are comparing their methodologies, connecting their findings, and highlighting the specific friction between their studies.
You, as the researcher, are the active moderator of this debate.
Right. You are guiding the narrative toward your identified research gap.
So wait, if I'm synthesizing, I'm not just summarizing their abstracts. I have to act almost like a judge in a courtroom. I am bringing these different researchers to the podium, forcing them to answer each other's claims.
Yes, pointing out where one ignored the other's data.
And showing the jury, the reader, that none of them actually solved the core problem.
Exactly.
But how do you structure that mechanically in a single paragraph? It sounds complicated.
It can be, but there is a highly effective four-step architectural framework for building a synthesized paragraph.
Let's hear it.
Step 1 is the introduction. You start by characterizing the general approach of the sources you are about to discuss, establishing the overarching theme. For example, you might write, recent literature evaluating reduced work weeks has heavily prioritized self-reported employee satisfaction over objective output metrics.
Okay, so you have set the stage and defined the commonality between the papers. What is step 2?
Step 2 is the connection. You emphasize how specific sources build upon one another.
Give me an example of that.
You could write, one recent study established a baseline correlation between 32-hour weeks and reduced burnout, a finding that another research team subsequently expanded by demonstrating how this reduced burnout decreases overall HR recruitment costs.
So you were showing the trajectory of the knowledge.
Right. But a debate isn't interesting without friction, so step 3 is the alternative view.
You introduced the conflict.
Exactly. You might write. However, a contrasting paper challenges this consensus, arguing that these cost savings are negated by the hidden overtime required to maintain project deadlines, utilizing longitudinal data that the previous studies failed to consider.
Oh, wow. You have now created serious tension.
And that tension perfectly sets up step 4, which is where you drop the hammer.
Highlighting the research gap.
Exactly. You conclude the synthesized paragraph by pointing out the void in this entire debate.
How would that sound?
While these studies thoroughly debate subjective burnout and HR costs, none of them employ objective, real-time software deployment metrics to measure actual week-over-week productivity, leaving a critical methodological gap in understanding the true corporate impact of the policy.
That is brilliant. You haven't just listed what they said. You have manipulated their findings to construct a runway that leads directly to your own research proposal.
It's all about control of the narrative.
But what happens if you pull these different studies into the paragraph and you realize they have absolutely nothing in common? Like they are researching entirely different variables and you cannot force them into a cohesive debate.
If there is no thematic connection between the primary sources you have extracted, then you have not defined your research question tightly enough during your Boolean searches.
Your net was too wide.
Exactly. The literature you select must revolve around a central gravitational axis. If it does not, you must return to the database, refine your inclusion criteria, and tighten your scope.
Okay, assuming the scope is tight and the synthesis is flowing, how do we organize the macro structure of the review? Like, do we just start from the oldest paper and move forward?
You can organize chronologically, tracing the development of a topic over time, but you must analyze the paradigm shifts, not just list the history.
Right. Nobody wants to read a boring timeline.
Exactly. A more powerful approach is a thematic review, organized around recurring concepts or variables.
So like dedicating one section to mental health impacts and another entirely to operational costs.
Yes. regardless of when the papers were published. There is also the theoretical structure, which focuses on how different definitions and models have been applied to the problem.
But thematic is usually best.
Thematic organization is typically the most aggressive and effective way to lead the reader toward a specific research gap.
Okay, so we have them conversing perfectly on the page. The final step, and this is the foundational practice that prevents academic ruin, is citation.
Yes, citations.
We are talking about academic integrity. But it goes deeper than just avoiding plagiarism, doesn't it? It is about how you deploy citations to control the psychological pacing of your writing.
The mechanics are non-negotiable. Frequent reference to the works of others is mandatory, predominantly through summarizing and paraphrasing.
Right.
But you must severely limit direct verbatim quotes.
Why is that? I feel like quoting people makes you sound more authoritative.
Actually, it's the opposite. If your review is merely a patchwork quilt of block quotes, it strips you of your authority as the moderator.
Oh, I see.
It suggests you are a passive compiler who can operate the copy and paste function, rather than an active analyst who has deeply internalized the material.
That makes total sense. When we paraphrase, our sources highlight a vital stylistic choice, the difference between author-prominent and information-prominent citations.
Yes, this is a crucial distinction.
Why does this matter to the reader?
It drastically alters the psychological focus of the sentence. An author-prominent citation places the original researcher front and center, making them the grammatical subject.
Like saying, according to a leading labor economist, a 4-day work week increases retention.
Exactly. You use this when the authority or reputation of the author is critical to the point you're making.
Right. And information prominent.
An information-prominent citation flips the structure. The data leads, and the citation is tucked into parentheses at the end.
So, a 4-day work week has been shown to increase retention by 15%, followed by the citation in brackets.
Exactly. Using information-prominent citations centers the objective truth of the data, whereas author-prominent centers the human who discovered it.
So mixing those two styles throughout a synthesis paragraph must create a highly engaging rhythmic cadence for the reader.
It absolutely does. It controls the flow of attention. It prevents the review from sounding like a robotic recitation.
And expertly weaving these citation styles with strong reporting verbs, like saying an author claims, proves, argues, or refutes, demonstrates total mastery over the material.
And fundamentally, you must rely on primary sources, avoiding the as cited in trap of secondary sources.
Right. If one researcher wrote a paper and a second researcher summarized it, you cannot cite the second researcher to talk about the first one's idea.
No, you cannot.
That is the academic equivalent of the telephone game. You have to hunt down the original data.
Because the second researcher's interpretation might be entirely flawed. And if you build on a flawed interpretation,
Your foundation collapses.
exactly like the 1998 dietary guidelines, everything comes full circle.
Wow. It really is a massive, intricate toolkit.
It is.
We have mapped the architecture of the literature review, transitioning from passive readers to active teachers. We have evaluated the algorithmic rigor of the systematic literature review against the fluid context of the narrative review.
We've covered a lot of ground.
And we've deployed advanced nested Boolean strings and proximity operators to surgically extract primary data from the deep web.
We have learned to utilize review papers as topographical maps to locate theoretical, empirical, practice, and methodological gaps.
We have confronted the invisible by meticulously conceptualizing our variables.
Demanding content validity while navigating the philosophical divide between positivist measurement and interpretivist meaning-making.
And finally, we have mastered the alchemy of synthesis, acting as the courtroom moderator to force conflicting studies into a debate that ultimately proves the necessity of our own research.
Locking it all down with precise, rhythmic citation practices.
It fundamentally rewires how you process information.
It really does. Which leads me to a final provocation for you, the listener, to consider.
Oh, lay it on us.
Now that you understand the rigorous mechanics of gap spotting, the necessity of conceptual clarity, and the critical difference between a passive summary and an active synthesis, try applying this analytical framework to the daily news, political debates, or social media feeds you consume.
Oh man, that sounds like a recipe for constant frustration.
It can be, but it is entirely eye-opening. The next time you read a long-form article or watch a video essay, ask yourself, is this journalist providing a true synthesis of the data, or are they just giving me a curated summary of events?
Right.
What is the methodological gap in how this news was reported? Who was excluded from the narrative? Have they rigorously conceptualized the emotionally charged terms they're using, or are they relying on ambiguity to manipulate the reader?
It's a powerful way to look at the world.
You will likely find that internalizing the architecture of academic research permanently upgrades your intellectual immune system. It grants you the X-ray vision necessary to dismantle and evaluate any argument presented to you in the modern world.
You stop being a passive consumer of the algorithm and become a critical architect of your own worldview.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into building a strong research foundation. Keep questioning the consensus. Keep hunting for the voids in the literature.
And remember, the next time you are tempted to aggressively search for validation of your own bias, pause, deploy a Boolean proximity operator, and see what the data actually has to say.
We will catch you on the next one.